think we identified the source of confusion.
Oh,
So.
was it me, probably?
No, well, Tara sent out an email with the agenda as an attachment and a link to the packet.
Yeah.
And the link to the packet had, everything. But some folks just saw the link, some folks didn't.
Oh, so it's out there, it's just.
It's out there, but.
You want to teach it?
Out there, just ignore
You're
it.
welcome.
Yeah,
No,
out
I
there,
don't care.
ignore it. That's right. Even if it had been more obvious, it probably would have been ignored. I wouldn't have.
God, I was also reading. Who sent it out?
Tara.
Packet? Do you have one for this meeting? Such a pro.
In fact, I fell asleep reading the ordinance.
Jeez.
Is that a jab?
So, gonna try to do those screens. So maybe you can just, I won't ask you to
Everybody
write
good?
too much, but if you could just give me like get it together over here if they're not the same. And if you feel so inclined, you can try it. Yeah, it's a little, we're piecing it together.
When did you lose the backup? No, it's there. I just didn't see it. Sometimes you wake up, you just split that off.
I was trying to cover my wounds up here. I got just like fell on my head. Yeah. I'll save it for afterwards. Are we good? Good afternoon. It is October 2nd, 2019. I'd like to call to order this joint meeting of the Greene County Council and Planning Commission. The time is now 2:04. Those in attendance are Kenny, Curtis, Mary, Rachel, Greg, Garish, Abby, Bob, Terry, Shaylin, Evan, Mila, and Zachariah. I'm only doing first names today.
Quick introduction.
Oh, yes.
And behind it.
Oh, and Chris. And I'll give Chris Baird, because there's so many Chris's. And Ruth. The one and only Ruth. And then we have an introduction of
Yeah.
a new face at the table.
Yeah, so I am happy to introduce the newest member of our staff team. This is Mila Dunbar-Irwin. She is in her first day today, jumping right into the mix here. She joins us from Jackson, Wyoming, and has a varied background that she can share with you. Probably at another time because we've got a lot to cover here, but really excited to have her on board, and please welcome her personally, professionally when we get a chance.
Glad to have you. Oh, I will have a moment for disclosures. So if any members would like to make any.
I would like to make this disclosure in the owner of bed and breakfast, ATR.
I will disclose that I own an interest in Nightly Rentals, and we also pay a lot of TRT tax. What's that? What's that? No, it means I sell a lot of units that are B&Bs and pay a lot of tax. Yeah.
Zachariah, would you like to lead us through this conversation?
Sure. So I'm going to do my best, and Mila's going to help me try to stay on top of this. I've got what I hope to be the same thing on both screens. This up right now is strictly what's shown in the packet, but it will serve as a good starting off point for our conversation. So I don't want to spend too much time on the background. Hopefully everyone is fully aware of the process and steps that have taken place to get us where we are, at least in terms of formal actions. For the sake of the record, what I'm referring to is the 6-month moratorium that was enacted in February of 2019, on February 5th. That was a moratorium on all new lodging developments. Following that, there was a very extensive public engagement and planning process, a lot of time on the part of staff and the public, and many of you, to evaluate potential changes to the Grand County Land Use Code with respect to overnight accommodations. The result of that process was the adoption of Ordinance 595 on July 18th, I think, of this year, ratified in the first county council meeting in August. The fundamental components of that ordinance was that overnight accommodations, all different types of overnight accommodations, were removed as principal uses or uses by right in all of the county's base zone districts. In place of those principal uses being in the base zone districts, in that ordinance, the county created overnight accommodations overlays. We already had an OAO zone district on the books at that time, so this was an expansion of that. We created 3 use-specific overnight accommodations overlays, one for hotels, motels, one for campgrounds and RV parks, one for residential units used as nightly rentals, condos, places that are commonly referred to as like Airbnbs. Right out of the gates, the county applied the overnight accommodations overlay, the use-specific, the appropriate use-specific overnight accommodations overlay to all parcels that had existing or vested projects on them. So anything that was in a commercial zone already operating as an overnight accommodation was given an overlay designation that matched the use on that property. There are still some legal non-conforming uses of bed and breakfasts and nightly rentals in residential zone districts that stayed as legal non-conforming uses. They were not really part of the conversation. There was some discussion about whether they should have been given the designation, but ultimately they were not. They just remain as legal non-conforming uses. At the same time as adopting that ordinance, the council adopted Resolution 3180. 3180 basically established a time clock for the county to establish new overnight accommodation standards. So by January 14th of 2020, the county can adopt new standards for overnight accommodations, whereby anyone who submits an application for an overnight accommodations development before then could be subject to the new standards. Okay, so that is really only pertinent to a handful of cases. Okay. There were a handful of properties that were designated with the overnight accommodations overlay that did not have vested projects at the time that Ordinance 595 was adopted. So those would be the handful of properties out in Thompson Springs, Crescent Junction, Cisco, and one property in what we would refer to as the Mohawk Valley, right? That's the property located behind Eastern Utah Community Credit Union. It used to be the Mohawk 4x4 property. Those parcels have the overlay attached to them, but they don't have complete applications for accommodations developments. So this situation would apply to them. Okay, so we have one property representative here. We have invited them to participate in the conversation because it is relevant to them. So I'm not chairing this meeting, but I'll let you determine how or when to sort of allow contributions.
Can everybody get their microphone? That's the only way the streamers can hear you.
Okay.
Switch that one.
So, for instance, Paul, correct?
Yes.
Paul represents the owners of the property behind Eastern Utah Community Credit Union. The overlay was attached to that parcel. They don't have a vested application in yet. If they were to submit a hotel site plan today, they could do that, right? They have the right to do that because they're covered by the overlay. But they could be subject to any new standards that are adopted by the county prior to January 14th, 2020. If we don't adopt new standards, we meaning the county, if we don't adopt new standards for hotel developments, well then the standards that are on the books at the time that they submit the application are the standards that they would be subject to meeting. Okay, I think they probably have an interest in waiting until we get the new standards on the books, because that's why we're all here today. I think it's fairly well known. The county has noticed developers that we intend to adopt these new standards by January of 2020, and so I think they're here to participate and also get a sense of like where things are going. It could also pertain to anyone who comes to the county and asks for the overnight accommodations overlay to be attached to their parcel, should you say yes. I don't anticipate that we're going to get any requests, but we could. That option is available to every landowner out in Grand County right now. And if you were to apply the designation, they also would kind of face the same situation as this property here. So that's the regulatory landscape that we exist in today. Is everyone clear on that? Let's get any questions out of the way on sort of where things stand today and why we're sitting here. Okay. If they resurface, so be it. In your packet, in the agenda summary, you've got a bunch of information about where staff and the Planning Commission are at in terms of evaluating new standards for overnight accommodations. Let me back up, actually.
I was just, while we're still in the background phase, could we get an update from Moab City about where they're at in the process, or is it?
Sure.
Whether
Laura
that's-
Shepard is here. She's the city planning director. If you want to jump in, I think we're probably in very similar places. to
Okay,
be honest.
I wasn't sure how far along you guys were.
Yeah, we're in a very similar place. We are, so Zachariah and I have been talking about these development standards, and the county has kind of taken, they've done some research, and then we've done some research, and so we've kind of pooled our resources, and the goal is to try to have consistent development standards wherever possible. So we're tracking together, which is why I came to the last couple of county planning commission meetings, and we've been kind of working through some of these with our planning commission. We're having a joint work session with our city council and planning commission on I'm not exactly sure when, either the 21st, the 22nd, or the 15th, depending on council's availability. Hopefully we'll determine that soon. And at that time, between then and now, I really need to just write code so that we have something down. And I've done some of that with this matrix. This matrix includes my ideas and the city's ideas as well as the county's.
Some slightly modified.
Some
right?
slightly modified, absolutely. I mean, situations are going to be different, and but so you know,
That was pretty much what I was unaware of how far along in the process you were, so it sounds like.
same
pretty
place.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're working very closely together, staff level. So let me step back. Another reason for having this conversation is that obviously, like throughout the moratorium process, establishing new standards was a big component of the motivation for that moratorium, and an obvious stated goal by many participants of that conversation. We didn't have time to fully flesh those standards out, or else we would have, included those in the ordinance that was ultimately adopted. So that's partly why we are still working on these. The other reason is that, at least in the county, I think, there is a mechanism in place, right, by which landowners can seek the right to develop overnight accommodations. The county has not fully eliminated overnight accommodations as a use in the county. It's just that now there's a legislative step in the process. It used to be a use by right. Now somebody has to come to the county, say, I want the right to develop lodging. Here's my plan. I'm submitting a development agreement and a master plan alongside my overlay request. It's processed very similar to a rezone, very similar to what we've been doing with the high-density housing overlays. And so by creating these new standards, the Planning Commission and the Council will now have a better guide and more comfort in saying yes or no, right? Instead of just kind of willy-nilly saying, oh, we like this project, we don't like this project, we like this developer, we don't like this developer. That's the intent behind establishing these standards, okay? So that's a lot of background, but I think it's, important for us to all be on the same page as what we're doing here. So in the staff summary, or in the recommendation, really what we need today is very, very clear direction from the county council to staff and to the planning commission in terms of next steps in working on these development standards. We want to get to a place where prior to January 14th, the process is smooth in terms of adoption. Okay? So as we have learned, I think that the best way to do that is through not a binding vote, but through a formal straw poll vote or clear direction rather than vague statements that then have to be interpreted. You really, and this is just a request to the council members who are here. Please do as best as you can in terms of clearly articulating what you want, and to the degree that we need some straw poll votes to determine where the majority is at. Let's do that. So as we've said in prior conversations, trying to keep you all abreast of where we are in this process, the 5 areas of development standards that we've really been focusing on are energy efficiency and emissions standards, water use and reuse, transportation infrastructure, and in particular multimodal opportunities, design and aesthetic standards, and then mixed use requirements. Okay, so included in your packet is a table that catalogs the findings to date, and these are based on staff research, preliminary conversations with the Planning Commission. You've also got in red italics several other general notes. Okay, what am I on? Oh, I'm controlling this one. So let's get to these notes. See if we can get to here. Thanks. So just so you're aware, many planning processes, we're not just pulling standards out of a hat, out of the blue, creating new ideas from scratch, although there is a time and a place for that, and we do some degree of that. But more importantly, we start from looking at other model codes, other communities that have dealt with these issues. Model codes meaning communities that have really good codes. And so in this instance, we've looked at places like Carbondale, Sedona, Aspen, Los Angeles, Park City, and others. And so that's where a lot of these standards were first discovered. We'll get to the standards, and that's what I really want direction on. But before we get to those, I want to just point out these general notes, okay? And that's because there's also a letter in your packet from 2 members of the Planning Commission requesting additional discussion on this, on some of these items, and I think that it does have merit. So if you remember the high-density housing overlay, we created boundaries or districts where properties within those districts would be deemed eligible to apply for the overlay. only properties within those districts can come to the county and seek the overlay application. We did not do that for the overnight accommodations overlay. So currently, any property in the county could come to the county and say, apply the OAO, the hotel, motel OAO to my parcel. The Planning Commission, and I think there's a lot of merit to this, at least some members of the Planning Commission have suggested that we do the same thing for the overnight accommodations overlay and create these eligibility districts, right? So you would put property owners on notice that if you weren't in one of these districts, the council is not even going to entertain a request. We started down that path with Landmark. It kind of fizzled out. We never got to the level of specificity that we needed to. Those kind of generic maps of what would be like targeted lodging development areas are included in your packet. You still hear some language out in the community and even some like council members and planning commissioners about these option 1 through 5, full steam ahead versus no growth scenarios. I don't want to get stuck on that language. The only reason I included them in your packet is to give you that documentation of where we had gotten in the conversation of eligible districts. And they were broadly speaking from the San Juan Grand County line north to Moab City limits along 191. The node around the USU Moab campus, downtown Moab, the edge of downtown Moab north to the Colorado River, those last 3 being all within city limits. And then from the Colorado River north to some undefined point, whether it be like the turnoff to Canyonlands National Park or the airport or even I-70. So that's kind of one category that's hanging out there that is not well defined in what the staff's findings are to date. Okay. The other point that I want to make is that we really need to focus on how you want to differentiate development, new development versus redevelopment. Okay, so in Ordinance 595, there was a prohibition against expansion of existing uses. Staff did not advocate for that. And my anticipation is that once we develop some of these new standards, that prohibition will either be relaxed or removed. And part of that is that if you want to see more lodging development in Moab and Grand County, in my opinion, the best place to do that is in areas where it's already existing, right? To allow an existing development to expand. And so most communities will allow that expansion by saying, any new accommodations would have to meet these new standards that we're going to talk about. And in order to have the right to expand, you need to, meet some percentage of that for the existing building. Or something like that, right? Where you're allowing an expansion, the expansion has to meet the new uses, and what exists, you need to get something more out of it, right? That's how a lot of communities will deal with that situation. So that's the second kind of general note. And then the last note is that we are aware that some of the standards that are in this table require long-term monitoring. Current staffing levels at the county would be prohibitive of doing that at the staff level. It's hard enough to deal with what we've got, including code enforcement, and so, any standard that's going to require long-term monitoring, I think, needs to be discussed in earnest, what it would take, or you need to be thinking about, who's responsible for doing that monitoring. In many states and jurisdictions, they require the developer, the owner of the property, to actually do that monitoring and submit annual audits or compliance reports or something like that. So that is an option.
What are some of the standards that might need continuing monitoring?
Water, energy mostly is one that obviously comes to mind. So let's jump into the standards then. And I apologize for the small size of the print. Let's see what we can.
Zachariah, before you jump in there, so this is my third time looking at these in a meeting setting, and I think the standards in general seem to apply pretty well for hotels, but maybe aren't applicable, or all of them aren't applicable to condominiums or other types of rental units or campgrounds. So at some point, it would be good to tease out the ones that are applicable to all kinds of overnight accommodations, and to develop new ones for those other uses other than hotels and motels.
I agree. Thank you for bringing that up.
And the second thing is, the elephant in the room is, is Moab and Grand County ready to start accepting new overnight accommodation applications, or should and this is what Kevin and I wrote to you, should we wait until the balance has been a different balance of residential units versus overnight accommodations units is met? So just throwing that out there, just to remind you that that's what one of the things that we were talking to you about. Yes, ma'am.
Are you, well, okay, when you say when it's met, you mean like, for instance, we have a lot of housing in the pipe right now between Aurora Crossing and a few of the overlays we've done. So there's lots in the pipe that are going to be developed. Do we add those to the percentage, or I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Or are you thinking that that is added after they are developed? In the planning, when they have been approved or when they've been created, I guess is what I'm asking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I would say once we have, well, if you're going to buy into this idea that the ratio needs to be established in order to meet the intent or the desire of most of the citizens who participated in the scoping meetings, what is the right percentage, and then how is it counted? So I see it as twofold. Is 40%, 60% what you want to see, or is it a different ratio? And then I would say at some point, as new residences come online, then that ratio would change, and if the target that you're looking for is met, then at that point, perhaps you would consider additional overnight accommodation applications, something like that.
Oh, can I ask another question?
Please.
The other question is, I'm in reading this, you say you have researched other resort communities such as Sedona and those areas. Do they have a percentage? Do we have a roadmap, another community that has created a percentage, or is this something we're creating?
I'm not aware of any that that are facing or approaching this issue with a trigger that says, okay, at this point in time, there's a demand and a need, which are different, but a demand and a need for more overnight accommodations, and we'll turn the light green and allow more applications to come in. But I'm not aware of any others.
There's one exception. Whistler, BC, does have caps on the number of overnight accommodations units. They, revisit that, periodically. I think when it was initially adopted, the assumption was that it was unchangeable. But I don't know that there are too many communities that are approaching it from a balance of residential units to overnight accommodations units. And I think I've brought up the ordinance that was adopted, and I think what I'm hearing from you is should that be a consideration that the Planning Commission and County Council look at when reviewing an overnight accommodations overlay application as a reason to say yes or no. And so that is a little different than like administrative standards that a development has to meet in terms of like, instead of like building height and mixed use requirements and energy performance. I will say that in the ordinance that we adopted as part of the application, an applicant has to include a narrative that includes a clear statement of how the proposed development provides benefits to the community as compared to development carried out in accordance with otherwise applicable zoning and development regulations. So, in other words, the underlying zone district. So an applicant has to state why they need this overlay, and why the development that the overlay would enable provides beneficial outcomes to the community. Even more, it's further described as a description of the beneficial public services and goods the project provides to the community. This should include a community benefit concept description and specific documentation of the proposed types, amounts, locations, and relationships of compatible uses provided within the development that provide beneficial public services and goods to the community. Examples of such uses may include mixed uses, residential uses, office, commercial, and civic uses, public open space, and indoor-outdoor gathering spaces. So what I hear from you is like, that should be added in as an item of consideration to like, the code that dictates, that gives the council some guidance on whether to say yes or no. Is that what? Okay, so like a metric.
Yeah, I think a metric would make it a lot easier when the council is looking at applications and say, well, yeah, they're going to provide a public horseshoe throwing arena, and so that's a public benefit maybe, but it's not, having a metric would make it as something tangible where there's a target to be met, and the council can set the ratio at any level that you feel is appropriate. The 2019 number might be a good one, or maybe go back to 2016, or pick a number, but it would make the job of the council members, I think, much simpler to say, okay, they've gone through this first gate, we have an overabundance of residential units at this point, so we have room for some more overnight accommodations. And you can say, okay, then we'll look at the rest of the standards to see if this is a good project. But first, decide on whether there is a real need, not a demand, but a real need for any more overnight accommodations.
I think also looking at the number of overnight essentially the number of rooms versus the number of housing units also helps illustrate, and that's so linked to affordable housing and employee housing. If we're looking at, I believe it was in the packet, that when everything that's in the pipeline is fully built out, we'll have 2 times as many hotel rooms as residential units in this county. I don't know that there's a math equation that shows like, oh, that means this many people need a place to live, but I think that helps give the context of the larger picture of growth in businesses that require employees who are going to be paid low wages and growth in places where those people can actually live.
Before we get too far down that path, I want the council to weigh in on that, because this conversation could take a long time. It's not the main thrust of what I anticipated for today, and I think at a minimum, we could set it aside and revisit it today still, but I think it's a very reasonable suggestion, but before we go too far along that, can we have some feedback from the council on how you want to proceed today?
I think, well, just in terms of the metrics in general, for me, I think some of the things worth evaluating are things like the infrastructure capabilities. I think that UDOT's already identified that 191 needs to be expanded, and it hasn't happened yet. We've already approved more hotels that haven't been built yet, and we haven't seen the impacts that those are going to have. And so, I think there might be other triggers besides a ratio that would kind of say, okay, now's the time that we would entertain, new applications versus hold off. We need to see how this is going to play out before, but that's just where I am.
I understand what we're trying to do. I don't really think we need to legislate, any trigger, because I think that those things are already there. I mean, if someone is coming in to apply for this overlay, and we need more nightly rentals or, lodging units, and we want more tax revenue, then, the county council should have the ability to understand that. If we feel like the infrastructure can't handle it, and for whatever policy goals, it's not in the community's best interest, then, then we don't need to approve the project. I mean, I think we have the ability to evaluate these things without trying to legislate it, in code.
Another thing that I'd be nervous about with the ratio idea is if it came close to that trigger, that might trigger a rush on applications. If it was like, oh, it's almost to the point where they're going to accept them, then we might get some half-baked ones that are trying to slide in there while the window's open. But
Yeah, I see that as a good thing, actually. It's like with the high-density overlay. If the Planning Commission and County Council had gotten all of them that have been proposed at one time, you could pick and choose which ones seem to be the best ones, the best fit for Grand County. And so I look at it completely different than you have, and I'm thinking that having a big packet of these to go through and sift through and say, let's pick out the best proposals and look at those more closely, maybe makes sense. So a gold rush of applications, to me, might be a good thing rather than a bad thing.
I can see that. Greg?
Get done, Mike.
One of the things that I saw prior to this last meeting, I was getting a lot of emails from people in the hotel business saying that they didn't want to see any reduction in the advertising because, as far as they could see, tourism has plateaued, if not starting to decline. Okay? And that's something we're not taking into consideration. I don't think we're going to see continuous growth. I mean, I really don't think it's ever going to be that way. It may go up and then it drop down and then come up again, but it's not going to be a straight shot up through the sky. And I think that's what people were really afraid of in the last few years, because they were seeing this steep climb. But yet, from what I'm hearing from the Travel Council and from that side, this is pretty much plateaued, if not starting to decline a little bit.
Do you think that some of, when you're talking about a plateau, is some of that plateau because there are more hotels, so there's increased competition, so an individual hotel is seeing a plateau in business because some of their potential increase in business is being sucked away by new hotels, or are you talking about like an overall system-wide?
I think it was overall, but the point is that if they have more of them, the cut is going to be even less. Okay?
This is terrible. I don't want to get off this topic entirely either. Zachariah talked about the HDHO. It works very nicely. There's a couple of nice things about it. One is we worked very, very, very hard. That doesn't mean we did it perfectly to get the right overlay. So that now when somebody asks to do it, we think, well, this looks like an appropriate appropriate place to have higher density, and that we actually have a very strong community benefit in 80% of those units being for permanent people. And so far on the table, and I don't want to hijack this, we don't have those same promises of community benefits anywhere in what we've been talking about, and we don't yet have overlays that say this is where you can build a hotel. And the direction I guess I want to impart from the county council is do we want those things? I understand that if somebody says they want to build a giant hotel right here on this block, you guys would probably say, guys and gals would say, this is inappropriate. But your job is made easier if you don't get one of these areas where you're not quite sure a hotel should be built, but somebody comes to you and makes some promises of having mixed design and certain setbacks. I think we need to know, do you want some of those things that'll help you make those decisions?
So I just got a question. I want to make sure I'm clear on the discussion because, so the question here is if someone's going to apply for the high-density housing overlay, do we want to, a mechanism in code to require a presentation of community benefit before these potential standards are applied to their project once they're admitted to the high-density housing overlay?
Oh, you mean
Overnight.
So,
Or, yeah,
it's a
excuse
great,
me.
it's a
A
great
lot of
question.
overlays.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think the way that I envision it is that these standards, like in the table, would be administrative standards. If somebody was in the overlay and they wanted to develop, whatever they were developing, they would just meet the standards in this table.
Okay.
So that would be after application of the overlay. The discussion that has taken place, over the last 15 minutes or so is, guidance or standards, guidance to the council in whether or not to apply the overlay in the first place.
On the front end of the application process.
So like what Bob said is, we did a lot of that work on the front end of the high-density housing overlay so that, really the primary community benefit that we were angling for in the high-density housing overlay was that 80% of the units would be deed restricted to people who live and work here. With the overnight accommodations overlay, all we have is this language here in the application that I had up on the screen earlier. And I read it, right? These community benefits, some examples being mixed uses, residential uses, office and commercial and civic uses, public open space, indoor, outdoor gathering spaces. So one approach, so there are kind of two parts to this conversation. One is, do you want to add some more specificity to these guiding principles of whether or not to apply an overlay to a project? But we also have a time clock on establishing these administrative standards. Okay, so like for instance, Mr. Jones over here, he doesn't probably care too much about, these guiding principles because their parcel is already included in the overlay. What he's concerned about, and not that we're having this meeting for him, but just to give you a real life example, right? They're interested in these standards, right? Because these are the administrative standards they're focused on having to meet or not meet.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And so we don't have a time clock on this. We can keep talking about these as long as the council wants.
And
These guiding principles.
And they don't need to be adopted simultaneously.
No. These, we have a time clock on.
Yeah.
These have to be adopted by January 14th, 2020, or Mr. Jones has the right to submit a site plan that only complies with, what we have on the books, which is essentially nothing. Okay?
Which should be fine with us, by the way.
Sure, that's good.
So a lot of decent conversation about like these overarching guiding principles, market principles, where you want to sit in the whole conversation of supply and demand. That's all great stuff. I think that definitely belongs in these overarching guiding principles, but we have a time clock on these standards.
I just have one question I'd like to ask Chris, if that's okay. We've been talking about the TRT is, that it's changed, and I just want some clarification for myself. From what I'm understanding is the growth we were anticipating didn't happen, but that we haven't seen a decrease in TRT. Am I right or wrong?
Just a decrease in growth.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is still
It's,
increasing each year, but not as fast as
So we're.
Decrease in the rate of growth, not in
Yeah,
growth.
the-
Yeah.
So
yeah,
we,
we closed out 2017 to 2018 with 7.6% growth. And, you know, it peaked out above 15% at one point, you know, during the Mighty Five campaign and whatnot, so.
In terms of the rate of growth.
so that's what I'm,
So it's
that's
hard
what
to
I
say,
understand.
I think it's hard to say whether or not it's normalizing or trending down at this point. It's hard to say which.
But it is still growing, it's just not growing at the pace we expected,
So-
right?
That's right.
So to that, you know, the chamber's been having a lot of these discussions, and there are a lot of lodging businesses that are reporting lower occupancy, which many people attribute to saturation of the market. But there are a lot of businesses that are good overall indicators, like City Market and restaurants that are coming forward to the chamber and opening up their books and saying, look, no, we're down. We've got, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of data, and we're definitely down, City Market being one of them. So, I mean, there is discussion out there that points to, the slow summer and the economy, trending down that's not directly tied to the oversaturation of lodging units.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
So
The stores downtown.
there's a lot of, there's different dynamics to the conversation, but that's one of them.
Did you have something, Jaylen?
Sure.
Please.
I wait my turn very nicely.
Sometimes not very
And
nice.
I'm happy to do that, because I don't really like speaking. So for me, I perhaps somewhat naively hope that we can institute all of these standards, because one of my original hopes when this whole process started was that we could have standards for overnight accommodations development that are very tough, very strict, but will give us a good end product and good community benefits. So I'd kind of like to see all of those looked at. And then the second part for me is, it was about, hard, fast rules. I would like some metric that is, maybe two metrics, I don't know, that would kind of take the guesswork out of the council's job, because I'm telling you, I don't like it when I have to make a decision, based on this to this to this on the high-density housing. I'd rather have some strict thing that says, yes, this meets the specifications, and move on and be done with it, so that down the road, we're not accused of playing favorites or, whatever else you get. So those are my two things on this particular topic, but I do think there is a question that was alluded to in the letter that we probably need to answer before too much more discussion goes on, and that is, do we want to stay with just the overnight accommodations overlays, or do we want to expand that to districts?
Yeah, so the issue of do we take the approach of the high-density housing overlay where you create basically eligibility boundaries?
Yeah. So just on the kind of the previous overarching, I think point that you made, it lays a good foundation for context, but so Garish and Kevin Walker, his letter to the council that we've got in our packet, and he's got you copied on. So I think the way, just to be clear, the way I read that, I mean, you guys make some good points, but really, aside from the fact that we need to get this hammered out, and that this is going to be, the guiding principles is going to be a really good discussion that I look forward to. But I think that the way that reads to me is it's coming from a place of concern that the council is going to accept applications for the overnight accommodations overlay in the future when it shouldn't. And you're naming some facts, one taken directly from the whereas statement. And my response to that, and in some ways my response to Jaylen's point is that sometimes legislative discretion can be squirrely with these issues, especially in the high-density housing overlay when we're being lobbied from all the neighbors and things. But, I mean, when we elect these council members, we're entrusting them to, have their finger on the pulse of a lot of different things, these quality of life issues, infrastructure issues, the budget and things like that. And I don't necessarily want to restrict, council's ability to weigh those things and engage in that analysis, to make these kinds of decisions. And so I think where you guys are coming from is we don't want any more overnight accommodations, and so we want to implement some metrics and language in the guiding principles to restrict the council's ability to adopt new overnight accommodations or make it really hard. And what I'm saying is we have the tools available to us to make that decision, weighing the right information at that time. So when we get to that portion, I look forward to that discussion. But to reiterate Zachariah, I am more than happy to see us kind of move straight into this, bread and butter of this policy.
I just have a couple of things to say. One is that somewhere over the past 3 weeks, in the massive amounts of material that we go through, I read that on the Wasatch Range and in the Salt Lake area, the standard ratio of residential to overnight accommodations is 66%, and in Moab it's 258%. So I think there needs to be some metric to show the balance between overnight accommodation numbers and residential numbers, because they're way out of whack. And I think that may be a good way to determine whether or not it's appropriate to bring on any more overnight accommodations. That's one thing. The second thing is with respect to the market being expansive or contractive, a lot of the numbers from these ancillary businesses other than the overnight accommodations have lost a lot of business because we pretty much lost all our tour bus business, and that's really impacted City Market. And that business has gone to Green River and to Monticello because Moab hasn't been really user-friendly to the tourist bus business. And if you look at the number of tourist buses that stop at City Market now versus the number that stopped 4 years ago, it's huge, the difference. And then the final thing I'd like to say is I agree with what you're saying, Curtis, and what Jaylen's saying is that, we ought to be focusing on these things and get that hammered out. And then, you can figure out the metrics you need to.
So can we make that turn now? We're about
Yeah.
55 minutes into the meeting.
Exactly.
Here's the point, is that there's no time limit on
this.
adjusting these guiding principles, adding metrics, creating overlay boundaries.
It's a guideline.
There is a January 14th, 2020 deadline on these, because we do have clearly one applicant that's waiting in the fold.
So let's get going.
So let's get going on those, okay?
I'll hold my response, Terry.
Good, because I have one for you.
All right. Energy.
Okay, so the goal here is to get basically kind of like thumbs up or thumbs down votes on these different elements. I'm seeing some eager hands over here. I'm not running the meeting, but
Do you mind if we have a couple of feedback components that you guys want us to wait on after you guys go through this matrix?
He has a meeting to get to, and so I was just wondering if you could spill his guts for a
Yeah,
minute.
there's been a lot of great dialogue with some of the departments, and I think everybody's been able to go through that, but that's your call.
What do you think?
Should we
Couple minutes?
Yeah, just about 3 minutes.
are they related to the standards? Okay, perfect.
Directly on the
Do
chart?
it.
Standard.
Okay.
Do it.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself for the record.
Shikan, work as a developer in town, but also sitting in as set engineering for the property owner as well. So we had a chance to kind of go through the matrix in itself. So let me first say thank you very much for all you guys for kind of getting together and really putting some attention to it. I think administratively, when you're looking at some of the sustainability and the energy components, if you don't adopt a single standard like a LEED certification, that opens up a whole can of worms administratively for the county and the amount of resources that takes to police something like that. So I would highly urge you guys to find a standard that already has the certifications attached to it, the requirements, the check boxes. Then it takes the manpower away. And that really addresses about 80% of what you guys already have down on the matrix, really about the energy usage, open space, biofill, all of those things. So that would be one point. Now, I would highly suggest as well, when you're looking at components like wooden shutters, I think you're really at that point micromanaging the development. Now, it doesn't mean that going through this process, you as council and commission can't come up with a design intent of what you're trying to achieve. Is it less solar gain, for example? And so putting shade structures in that reduces that might be, again, driving towards design intent instead of micromanaging what the wood is versus the specific product. So from the hospitality world, when you're looking at mixed-use development and having hospitality mixed with other commercial, please let the market drive what those spaces will entail. Doctors' offices, childcare facilities just don't mix in a hotel lobby, right? So let the market kind of demand that, and I think taking it from development by development. The other components as well is that when you're doing overnight rental hospitality hotels, economically you can't have open space and reduce height restrictions and make the project work. So what's going to happen is that you're going to have more land preoccupied by hotels, right? That hotel has to get spread out over more properties. So something to consider as well. Bicycle storage is, again, very much a market-driven thing. It will not reduce traffic or people from coming to Moab. So that was my 2 cents. So thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
I'd have some responses to that.
Okay.
But I don't want to have too much if the council and planning
Let's hear
commission
Wells
care to
Fresh.
hear some responses, I think, I certainly agree. Our on some of the points with respect to energy standards, it's going to be administratively way easier for us to just have one standard. There are trade-offs, and these are noted out right in the comments. There's a trade-off between requiring a developer to meet a LEED standard versus just saying, be net zero. And the reason is that it costs to get LEED certified, right? And so many communities have just said, well, so be it, right? The developer will bear that cost, but at least we know that they've gone through the LEED certification process, and it's just simpler and it reduces the administrative burden. I'm curious to hear from you how that appears if the county is okay, be LEED platinum. Because you're going to have to go through that certification process, which is an exterior certification process that has nothing to do with the county. But you know what it is.
So I think that's, from a development standpoint, at least we know what those parameters are, right? And to run the economics behind that. Now, LEED certifications are expensive. So something to balance here is that, do you want the development to actually take that money and create and implement it physically on the site for energy usage or limiting energy usage? Or do you want them to go spend it on this certification, right? Because those are real dollars at the end of the day. But having those requirements, I think broadly, again, super reduces down the resources administratively so that you guys don't have to police it. But at the end of the day, the development knows what those requirements are.
So if we were to say, for instance, it needs to be net zero, that's not a certification standard, but you know what it means,
Impossible.
right?
Right.
Or the county could say, you need to produce 80% of your energy requirements on site, or through, purchase of renewable energy credits, or 60% on site and 20% of it needs to be, through the purchase of renewable credits. Again, like, that's not an official standard, but it's a standard, it's
Right,
pretty clear.
it's a very black and white a requirement, but I will say from a hospitality standpoint, getting to a net zero on a hotel, which is a 24/7 service, and energy consumption, it just doesn't happen at that point.
So are you saying that kind of separating these certifications and the time, energy, resources that goes into those is sacrificing the actual goal behind that in some ways, and to make a building more green?
Sometimes
And I would agree.
economically, yeah.
I would agree. Like,
Absolutely.
and that's why we've said, in this comment box, there are trade-offs, right? Some of the money that goes to the certification process is money that could have been spent on actual energy efficiency infrastructure.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about biofuel and retention, all of those things are great items to discuss and have some sort of regulation around it. But those components are part of the LEED certification in itself, right? So
I don't know if the
is it biofuel?
I don't know
Or
if
the infiltration.
biofiltration stuff is. I mean, typically LEED is just energy efficiency.
So then essentially, I guess going back to what I was saying was that essentially those certifications have the check marks. That gives you guys, from a county standpoint or commission standpoint, that knows that, all right, it's stamped, we're getting the 80% of what we're requesting in this matrix. But yes, it does cost money to do that certification, so it may take away from truly implementing something very, the design intent or whatever.
So
was in the
what
development.
would that look like just theoretically? So if we're saying, so let's just say, okay, hey, the council decided that we don't want to pursue the LEED certification, because of the time and energy and resources, not only to the developer, but staff too. And we would just soon, get straight to the goals. Does that make it, is that going to make it more confusing though? Because you don't have that package of that certificate.
Right. But that's exactly what I'm getting at here, and I'm hearing really conflicting statements from you, Sheik. So I'm going to put
Okay,
you
go
on the
ahead.
spot
Go,
and say,
please.
what would you prefer? Do you want the LEED requirement and have to spend the money on the certification, or do you want the net zero requirement, which is what we've recommended, or something like that, and you get to choose, how to meet that?
So I think you're right. You're hearing conflicted information because from a development standpoint, at the end of the day, the economics kind of pushes all of it, right? So the LEED certification in itself, or if it's net zero, so net zero building on a hospitality or hotel is just not going to happen. So development will not happen, period. It's a 24/7 a facility. If you're going to adopt something, I think it would be the LEED certification. But again, that LEED certification dollars can be directly used to affect the physical,
that's
site.
fair. Yeah. But
And
I don't think-
as a developer, I think we have to
Yeah.
look at it from an economic standpoint.
And the reality is that the development community is not going to like these standards, so you got to,
Right,
remember that.
right.
But we're not blind to economics either, and I'm going to invite Nora to chime in here certainly whenever you feel, inclined to do so. But let's talk about a modification of this net zero requirement. So net zero, for everybody sitting around the table, means that a development is essentially producing
As much
all of the energy that it consumes, okay, on site. So it's doing that through solar or geothermal or wind, right? And so what we're hearing from Sheik, and this one developer, right, is that it's not possible to do that for a hotel development. Well, I can't verify that for you, at the staff level today. But
Economically.
let's just say, for the purposes of the conversation, that's true, and so you want to try to modify it. Well, there is a point where you know, a hotel development could generate a percentage of its energy needs and then purchase the rest of it through renewable credits or something like that. I don't know what those numbers are, but I don't think that's at all outside the realm of a reasonable requirement. You know, maybe it's you need to generate 50% of your energy that you consume on site. And then 25% more you have to purchase through blue sky credits or something like that.
And enforcement or monitoring of that would fall back on the county.
Well, so that was one of the notes that I brought up, is that, you know, we don't have current staffing levels to do that. So I think that it would fall on the developer to submit an annual audit, right? An energy audit, you know, produced by a third party, WattSmart, you know, consultant, a Rocky Mountain Power, or EPA WattSmart person.
So, Zachary, what I suggest is, I think this is really great, and we could have a lot more in-depth discussion at planning commission meetings, because we're going to be taking direction from the council and trying to flesh out more details. So I invite you to come to our meeting. I assume next Tuesday we'll have this on the agenda. So please come and share your thoughts on any of the standards at that time. But
Well,
we're going to get bogged down with,
Yeah.
this is the first category in a number of standards, and we don't really have time to spend a lot of time at this meeting having a lot of discussion
I
about it.
appreciate it. I want to just respond to one more item, which was the bicycle storage. We're not,
Great amenity, I agree. So I support it.
well, I think the point there is not so much like, you know, how do these, like, how do I phrase this? There is a balance between, you know, what the market will do on its own versus what regulation has to force the market to do.
Always.
And part of this conversation, in particular about transportation and multimodal transportation, is that we know we have a congestion problem that can't be solved entirely through, like an expansion to Main Street. And so I think part of the regulations that you're seeing up here is like, you know, how do you force some behavior change in terms of the impacts of additional growth and accommodations?
And I guess just the point, I understand that point, and I just want to make sure that we're framing it around that it has no direct correlation to reduced tourism because, you know,
Well, right. I mean, this
or
is all
park
about new
visitation or
growth.
anything, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's all, you know, right?
Our
And
project will have a bike storage, by the way.
Right.
Just that we're planning to do that.
it's Moab.
And bikes.
Sure.
The shuttle made less sense to me because I was kind of like a shuttle to wear. But, you know, that seemed a little bit,
Town.
that seemed a little bit weird to me.
Well, I mean, okay, let's keep talking about that when we get to that section.
So one more point on the soluble soils as well, and we'll definitely be at the commission meeting. I think taking it by project would make a little bit more sense because there's different levels of hydration in the soil depending on what part of the county you're in and what development you're in. So to set a specific standard for all hotels, I don't think that quite makes sense.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you.
Are you
Thanks for
going to
being part
stay,
of the
Paul?
process.
I'll be here.
Okay.
So, with the time we have remaining, what's going to be most beneficial for the
Could we
plan?
go into 4?
We can go, I mean.
I don't
can
know
go
if we
until-
had a,
We don't have an end time, but I kind of anticipated at least 4 o'clock. Are folks prepared to?
I don't know if we'll go much past 4.
I don't know that we'll go past that either, but
So-
are folks okay until 4 o'clock?
So the next category is water, and
What, did we come up with
Well,
anything?
before we move on from energy, is everybody, is the council, and I'm really speaking to the council here, are you sort of, do you feel like you've got your hands around some of the options for energy-related standards?
What is,
Based on the conversation that just ensued?
what is LEED Silver or LBC certified? I have no idea.
LBC is Living Building Challenge. They're all just ways to measure efficiency. So, and LEED certification has been around for a lot of years now, and that was kind of the standard when you were trying to deal with energy efficiency. And that has been eclipsed a little bit because the LEED program is expensive, and you have to make, all these changes, and people are going more toward, maybe it's 80% of net zero, or maybe it's 50%, but, coming up with some kind of a standard that doesn't require necessarily the expensive certification project. But if an applicant wants to do that, more power to them,
So from the council, are you looking today for something that says, let's go with the certification route, or let's go for the in-house route?
I think it would be helpful for the planning commission and staff to know, are you leaning more towards, well, first, do you support this concept? And second, are you leaning more towards like a percentage of net zero or just a standard certification?
Could I ask just one quick question? When I first read this, I thought it was literally, or you could do it any of these ways. Is there a problem with doing it?
I don't see that as a problem either.
Like leaving multiple options that.
Yeah, however they want to meet it, they
Yeah.
can meet it.
And these are examples, right? We're not necessarily suggesting LEED silver. I would say, at least LEED gold. But, there's bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. It's not that hard to meet gold, bronze or silver. So.
Does the Living Building Challenge, does that bleed over into other areas besides energy?
It does, yeah. So if somebody were to meet the Living Building Challenge, they'd probably meet all of these.
Yeah.
So I'm, just based off, I thought that was a really good discussion, just to kind of get us into the heart of the, the debate or the discussion between kind of net zero approach or one of these certified approaches. So I am in support of the non-certified route, but I would like to better understand, what that, how high of a bar that is, as far as feasibility for the projects themselves. I'm not a fan of these fancy certifications that require a bunch of paperwork and bureaucratic process. I would rather, in my opinion, we would be better off to leave them some flexibility in how they get there, but set that very clear bar that's more driven towards the product and not a fancy label. Is where I'm at.
Mary?
What I would like to, some knowledge I'd like to have and perhaps put in is find out where there is a hospitality hotel motel that is considered the creme of the creme, that is really producing as close to net zero building and it's still profitable, and set that as a standard. So that we have there's got to be an example out there where somebody has created a motel, hotel that is as close as they could get to net zero and still be profitable, and then set that as the bar.
So Mila has just found 2 of them in Europe that are actually net zero. One of them is net positive.
Europe's gonna have all
So it
kinds
is
of-
Yeah, but some of those safari tents in Africa are pretty low.
I bet so. But, have some, some.
Frames of
Yeah,
reference.
some
Frame
frames.
of
So we
reference.
can do that as well. I also, just to jump in real quickly, I like the option of maybe setting a standard that is the underlying objective, but also having the option to just meet one of these.
Right, it seems like LEED standard would meet the underlying objective. so
Right.
it would work.
Yeah, I wonder about if there's other values that an outside certification would provide, like updating standards as technologies evolve and things like that,
Yeah.
so that we don't have to go into our code every few years, And I don't know if that's something to speak to, or if that's, like if we just choose one of these certifications and say this is what we want, that then,
Yeah, they deal with the ongoing updates to it
Yeah.
externally. Yeah, that's an advantage, certainly. Like the building code does that a lot, right?
Yeah.
Our building department doesn't come up with the new building codes, they just reference what the International Code Council does.
Is there
Or
an
FEMA does.
exterior reference like that for this kind of thing that's not necessarily paying a third party for a certification, but
No, it's just, that's why those certification programs
Yeah.
exist, unless some of you are aware of.
I do know some building, or some people use the standards and don't require certification.
Right.
That's an option.
And I think that's great. That was kind of what we were going at with the net zero. It's just that we don't have the capacity on the staff side to prove whether those standards are being met or not. So that's the benefit of not doing that in-house.
And so the idea of an audit would be done periodically, and that would be something that they would have to submit in perpetuity, and then that would be reviewed by county staff to see if they're up to par.
I think that's, yeah. I think that's how you would ensure that they were meeting the standards, over time. Maybe it's not every year, maybe it's every 2 years.
I mean, it would seem to me that the closer that they could get to net zero, the better it would be financially for them.
The long run.
Because one of their huge expenses is electricity. And if they're producing part of their own, that's going to really help out their bottom line.
Yeah, it's a higher upfront cost and lower
Yeah.
ongoing costs. I don't know if you want to speak to this.
We think it would be cost prohibitive. I think if net zero is adopted, there's a reason there's only 2 in the entire world. I mean, that says it all. I will say that the cost of solar photovoltaic is reducing. It's probably the lowest it's ever been. And I would just say with that knowledge, it's not feasible.
Which is why I think if I were to have to make a recommendation today, I would be saying, peg a percentage of net zero. Or a percentage of energy consumption, maybe a little bit more in terms of renewable purchases, or if somebody wanted to use one of these standards, that's their prerogative. So that we can move on, how does that sound to council? I'm
That
seeing a lot of
sounds good
head
to me.
nods, does that?
Yeah, so,
Percent of net zero or.
or net something, or
Not net zero, but a percentage
You're gonna do a
of
percentage
consumption.
because net
Yes.
zero is financially infeasible. I mean, it truly is.
Okay, so can we do a straw poll just so that there's no confusion? Maybe just a show of hands, who's on board with that?
Are you going to state what we're polling?
Yeah, state it first.
Okay, so this is from the council. Should staff and planning commission move forward with the idea that we will have an energy standard that is a percentage of on-site energy consumption or an established standard like LEED certification or Living Building Challenge?
Meaning the
Oh.
option.
Yeah, the option.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm on board with that, but obviously that direction, but the decision is what that percentage is.
Correct, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can work on that.
Yes, you should move forward on that.
Okay.
I'm personally on the fence between the certification and managing that in-house, but
Where are you, Greg?
Really, I mean, it's the same reason I don't have solar on my house. Put in a big solar thing's gonna cost me $20,000. I am never going to see that paid off by energy saving in my lifetime.
But do you support this concept?
Even I've got solar on my house, Greg, come on, man.
you are such a hippie.
That's good. That's right, kidding me?
Got a lot of money.
How does that make me hypocritical?
Oh, he's a hippie.
He's
not
a hippie.
hypocritical.
My mom's half hippie, you'd be surprised.
Yeah, I know your mom.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'd like to see them do something to make it end.
Okay.
But not to the point that it's gonna cripple them financially.
We don't want to do that.
Right, but I would like to see any development that's coming in, something that we're all excited about, and that we can say, this is the face of Moab, and this is what we're into, so.
Okay.
The idea,
There's a development
So,
center right
happy to, work on that percentage, that sort of concept.
Okay.
Feel free to.
We got one, keep it on the list. Next.
Okay, so water, the standards that we have looked at to date are that new developments would be required to utilize rainwater catchment systems. How much they could catch is a function of state code. It's an easy external standard to refer to. The code, the state code is in that comment box. I don't think it costs that much money, and it's beneficial to the development to reduce their own, water draws. Water-wise landscaping, and only 20% of the landscaped area being turf grass. Very common standard in arid regions, not that egregious at all, in my opinion. Bioretention and bioinfiltration stormwater systems, these are allowed by code now. We work with Jeff of Set Engineering on a lot of these designs.
What are they? I don't know.
So a bioinfiltration system or a bioretention system differs from a traditional stormwater management system in that it utilizes infiltration into natural soils, vegetation that, Mila could probably talk to this a lot better than I can. She has an ecology background, but basically uses vegetation to process stormwater so that it reduces the burden on your sort of man-made stormwater system. It removes pollutants from stormwater runoff. And so instead of piping stormwater runoff into a box and then sending it into a stormwater conveyance system, you're using natural features to manage the stormwater.
Is there anything about using gray water?
So we initially had that concept in the development standards that new developments would have to install gray water reuse systems. The more we looked at it, the harder we thought it would be at scale. It's not that hard to do on a single family home. It's pretty difficult to do on a hotel. So this is maybe one of those areas where you differentiate between hotels and campgrounds and condominiums. It'd be pretty difficult on a condominium development as well to do a gray water system, depending on the design. I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but. And then the last one was shading pools. The Planning Commission didn't really like that, and so we're recommending just removing that from the list. So, thoughts on those standards?
So I like this stated that we would require up to 2,000 gallon rainwater catchments, but I think the standard should say that that water needs to be put to a beneficial use. Otherwise, they could just have a tank in the ground that fills up and eventually goes into the sewer system. So I think we could work on that a little bit, Zachariah, but the beneficial uses that I see would be to augment the landscaping that's there. And I think we should specify xeriscaping as part of that landscape scheme.
I would like to see.
Water-wise xeriscape is different than water-wise.
Sure.
So we could talk about that.
I would like to see something about water consumption, and and just kind of having some design intent around that.
What do you mean beyond what we've talked about? Like a cap on water consumption? Is that what you're talking about, or?
Or, I mean, maybe a cap or something that, would encourage, reusing laundry water in a way that they could, or, I think, I don't know a standard off the top of my head, but I think, with that design intent, that there's, things besides the landscaping, low flow shower heads, the washing your hands on the back of the toilet. I think there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of, the thing that differs between overnight accommodations and residential stuff is the frequency of laundry, the frequency of showers, things that, and I would just like to see, a big driving force for, slowing some of the development in the valley was concerns over water. And I think that that's a big thing that needs to be included.
The Moab Planning Commission agreed. In fact, they would like to, several of them want to be really aggressive about, basing it on the amount of water availability we have, which is yet to be pinned down, and I'm not sure it ever will be. But, yeah, they felt that that was a really important thing to try to get along.
I mean, to Sheik's point, I don't want to micromanage the shower head type or the whatever. So maybe there's a broader standard that could be.
And commercial code right now, for hotel motel requires reduced flow toilets, shower heads. All the fixtures have to meet a certain standard today.
Do we have that on the books in the county?
Yeah,
Well, it's in the building
Uniform
code,
building
but
code.
again, we looked
But
at
you
this
can
as
go above
well,
and beyond.
and, I mean, we don't have that many private sector representatives here today, but, when we looked at that, we kind of felt like the reality was that, all these developments are putting in low flow stuff anyways, and I don't want to be reviewing 70 toilet applications.
So is there, in one of the other third-party certifications, do they address water use?
Well, and certainly in Living Building Challenge, they do.
Yeah.
I would
I think LEED says
LEED
so.
does as well.
Do they highlight a standard there? I mean, even I'm more just thinking at the meter, like a cap or,
Oh, no, I'm not aware of any that put a cap on
Yeah.
consumption.
No, Evan, I was wondering if that's where you were kind of going with this. Do you see a maximum 150 gallons per person per guest day or something like that?
I mean,
Which might be a stretch, but leave it up to them to figure out
exactly.
how to meet that?
Yeah. I fully respect not wanting to get into reviewing 70 toilets and shower heads, but, if there was something like that, and I don't know how the Living Building Challenge or LEED calls it out, but that's kind of something what I was imagining. Just so that when projects are coming to us, we know more, we have a better idea of the impact that they would have in the area. I mean, if there's a Bellagio fountain outside and it's evaporating, then it's like, oh, maybe we do want this pool thing in there, so.
I would just say that will have economic driving it down anyway. The projects want this, utilities, water, and so our project would be interested in that run around. I don't know if we want a cap. Maybe you gotta take it for a toilet tax or something like that. Hard to monitor.
Yeah.
I think it would be very easy to monitor. You could do a quick analysis of the number of guests you had and the number of gallons you consumed, and it's simple division. And water in Moab is really cheap. It's not going to be one of your major expenses.
Mary?
I agree with taking shade, keeping the pools have to be indoors or shaded. I agree with the planning commission, let's take that off.
Okay, so, let's see. Are there any, I guess, what I would like to do is maybe take some straw poll votes on the 3 items that, are in that list, and then if there are additional standards that council wants to see the planning commission and staff work on, let's get those out on the table with maybe some straw poll votes as well. So let's go one by one if that's okay. Who's in favor of requiring a rainwater catchment system put to beneficial use to offset landscaping? One.
I guess so. Just looking at that, I'm thinking 2,500 gallons with state registration. I mean, it just doesn't move the needle much for a hotel. And, I mean, not that it's a bad thing, but.
Yeah, it's not.
I'm wondering, where you're sacrificing economics there to not make much of an impact. They could make them, say, more energy efficient or something, so it's hard. 'Cause I'm thinking about all these things together. I would be more interested in that requirement when we're looking at, some residential stuff. But anyways, so I will raise my hand, but.
Okay.
Any more
And I
questions?
think that there's a really good point there, and that, and this is noted in the staff report, some of these standards, even though we're looking at them for lodging developments, are really good standards to be looking at for residential development standards. And that being an obvious one.
I was up visiting my son in Salt Lake, and we were out for a walk. We came to an area and it looked like grass, and it wasn't real grass. It was turf,
Yeah.
but it looks really good. It's not like the old stuff, that looked funny. This really looked like grass.
Yeah.
The water is on, cut it, just there.
There are some other issues with that. It tends to get really hot, regardless of, people that have larger areas have to water it because it gets too hot. So that kind of defeats the purpose. But certainly in certain applications, I think it could make sense.
Most of the areas that you look at around the hotel don't have a whole lot of grass. They got little patches here, little patches there, corners. Make it easy.
Okay, so
Synthetic rather
in favor of rainwater catch requirement, show of hands. Okay. Whether it's water-wise or zero-scape requirement and the maximum percentage of landscaped area being turf grass, show of hands in favor of that.
Christian's in favor of it.
Okay, these are just straw polls, nothing like formal.
Landscape.
Is that a problem for the record keeping? Is that?
No.
This is really just for staff and planning commission to.
Yeah.
And then I'll
Okay.
make those minutes, because I can't even see everybody, and everybody, whenever you do a straw poll, people tell stories, and they talk about something else in the middle,
Okay.
and so it's really hard to.
Taking that personal, Chris.
Okay, so I'll give you my highlighted
Yeah,
bullet
you can
points of
just,
these for sure.
Send me your.
Yeah.
Sometimes the straw poll just won't allow for the discussion that we need to have.
Okay. Is it okay if I'm just doing majority yes or no? These straw polls.
Well, I would
Do you want
think that
numbers?
I think,
I would think you want to write
Okay.
down how everybody is.
Okay.
they were all unanimous so far, weren't they?
So far.
Oh.
Yeah,
Well,
How many-
Kurt voted against the.
but then he voted
No,
yes.
then he voted for it.
No, I'm just attaching a lot of.
So you spoke against it and then.
That's exactly what he did. I'm attaching a lot. All of mine are really conditional. Really, really conditional.
votes.
It's just giving us my
For good
direction
reason.
to start working in.
I refuse to be a lemming.
Well, I think the straw polls though are, should staff continue to pursue this idea?
Yes.
And so that's the question. Should staff
Yeah.
put time?
Yeah, because we don't want to.
I understand the question, Carl.
Yeah.
We don't want to put time into something that.
Okay, and then the last one is that for stormwater management systems, to the degree possible, should we require new lodging developments to use bioinfiltration or bioretention systems to manage their stormwater? There may be some circumstances where our engineer says, no, this isn't, it's just not going to function well enough, right? But where possible, do you want to require that?
Where the engineer deems that it is
Where it's feasible?
feasible, I think, yes. But it, with that caveat.
Okay.
Yes.
6-0. Greg? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
Much faster.
County council's throwing you guys under the bus.
Could you record my comments without an interest in,
Yes.
thank you.
We have
Kevin has an interest in
come to the meeting, and somebody doesn't.
a max, like gallons per unit or gallons per user day, something like that.
I think a lot of these address exterior water, and I was.
In indoor water use.
Yeah,
Okay.
Culinary water use, which is.
yeah.
It's biggie anyway, right?
Okay.
No water bottle.
Okay. So can we move on to transportation?
Yeah.
All right. So,
So we're not gonna talk about pools.
no, that's off the list.
Well, yeah, well, I said,
Did you want to arm wrestle for pools?
Well,
Nope.
I can speak from experience. I have a pool,
Uh-huh.
and I cover it with a solar blanket at night to prevent evaporation, and which also prevents heat loss,
Mm.
because evaporation takes the heat out of the pool, okay? So I can maintain my pool at from 90 to 100 degrees in the summer with nothing using electric or gas.
That's when you want to be jumping into an ice tub.
Just complete, just total solar.
Yeah, okay. Well, are there any other interests in revisiting the pool issue?
Let it be.
Okay, 1 to 5. I'm gonna call that a vote.
out how to do it to make it
Okay.
as energy efficient as possible.
I'll go with Greg for nighttime shading,
Okay, we got-
covering.
We got 2 to 4.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, moving on to transportation. Just to give you a sense of what staff has talked about at this stage, we heard a comment about the shuttle from our hotel representative here. Here's what I see being the best solution for transportation requirements, is that we create 2 lists. List A would be required improvements. List B would be you have to implement, two of the 5 or whatever that are in this list. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm attached to, what goes into each of those lists. And so I think today we can have some conversation about, what's appropriate for those lists, and then, I think let the planning commission determine, maybe what goes into list A versus B. So, at least from my perspective, I think what I'm looking for is like, does the council and the planning commission like that approach of having this like
A list and saying they have
yeah.
to implement so many of them.
yeah, like, so list A, you gotta do all of these things. List B, you gotta do, 2 out of 5, or 2 out of 6, or 2 out of 10, or whatever it is.
And
3 out of 10, or,
we're just talking about 5 things on the list, or?
No, I'm
or
not
would
saying we have that
potentially be-
full list yet.
Okay.
I'm saying, do you like that approach of like,
Uh,
there are some required transportation improvements, and there are some that
Yeah,
are required, but, which ones are required is up to you.
right. Like if somebody's building a place in Cisco, I don't know.
A shuttle doesn't,
Yeah.
Maybe it works even better.
maybe it works better out there,
Bicycles.
yeah.
Like they might
Sure.
not need to have
Exactly.
motorized scooters in Cisco.
Exactly,
So one of the thoughts I have on shuttles is, we don't have a free shuttle system.
correct.
And to require one hotel the first hotel that gets constructed after these standards to initiate a shuttle system independently is probably not realistic. But maybe the requirement would be that they have to build into their design a shuttle stop, a place to drop off and pick up passengers where there's no other parking allowed, and it's accessible to the front door of the hotel and that sort of thing, so that if and when the shuttle ever comes, they won't have to retrofit, or they won't be able to say, hey, we can't handle it because we didn't design for it.
And that's in this list, yeah, absolutely. And
I'd like
that's
to see
common,
the list, and I'm supportive of this,
the approach.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
To give developers options.
Yeah. I'm interested in hearing from you, but if you're going to be part of the conversation, let's pull you in at the table and have you formally introduce yourself for the public records. Thank you.
Paul Jones, for Pillar Investment Group. We're the owner of the property behind the crate. I actually just wondered what the policy goal was behind this particular one, if that could be stated. I don't, what's the objective?
So, once people come into town, that then they can leave the car and ease the congestions downtown.
Okay.
And so whether that's alternative transportation that's human-powered or other things, it's just to avoid every room needing to drive to a restaurant, drive to the gear shop, drive to the parks. And one of my questions about those shuttles was, driving to trailheads, if they would need separate permits with land managers there and stuff.
It would. The goal is to lower congestion, probably lower the carbon print.
Right. And it may be that, that requirement is reserved for projects that are larger than X number of square feet. I mean, that's something you could consider also. And it could be a van initially.
Right. And a lot of hotels are already doing it,
already
right?
do
You're
that,
seeing the
yeah.
archway, you're seeing, restaurants do it. It's a service. People are now expecting it, right? To some degree, we just want to say, you got to do it. I think, because we are all complicit in creating transportation challenges in Moab. And so we all need to be part of fixing that.
I like the two list.
Okay.
Is that where we were still?
Yeah, so can we get just a straw poll vote on this approach of having mandatory requirements and then, choose what you want to do list?
What are you thinking on the mandatory?
Well, let's vote on the approach and then maybe we can just have you throw out some ideas that you want the planning commission to consider.
I like the approach.
Okay.
Say it again.
This approach of having a list A and a list B. You got to do everything in list A and you got to do some number of the items in list B.
Whatever you want, but it has to, with the goal of reducing congestion and improving your quality.
Yeah, allow you to choose what is more appropriate from that list for specific development.
I almost think it would, this is a big statement, but I almost think it would be a better use of time, if we just, everybody read through this and just say, here are the things that I'm not in support of going forward, so you don't have to walk everybody through this.
But that has created such problems in the past with travel council going forward with thinking they have this and then somebody didn't read something or something wasn't here. I think having a clear straw poll will make our work easier later.
Okay, you're for the two lists, Curtis is for the two lists, Mary is for the two lists, Jalen is for the two lists, you're for the two lists, Greg, where you at? You're for the two lists, okay. So, I think, let's maybe just take no more than 3 minutes, just kind of fire hose ideas of what you would want to see in those lists. You don't have to say, are they in list A or B? We heard the shuttle stop, the integration of the shuttle stop into the hotel. That's on our list.
Bicycle thing is always good.
Okay.
So we're talking about list A here?
Well, I think,
Either
no,
list.
just
Any ideas that you
any
want
ideas.
on there somewhere.
And if you don't have any, that's fine too. I mean, we'll just keep working on it. I'm just giving you an opportunity. This is your
Ideas.
shot to throw out some
Having
ideas.
some bicycles available for use.
Right,
Okay.
I agree.
Say, oh, $5, I can use this bicycle all day.
I think if they're e-bikes, you need to get more.
Yeah, you do, but
E-bikes, there's a big discussion around right now.
Okay, but we're gonna just add them to the list.
Yes, we'll add them to the list.
E-bikes are here to stay.
Yes.
I know they are.
How could they not be? I hate to tell you.
I know they are.
I like the supporting the trails, and I wonder if it would be beneficial to flesh that out to active transportation.
Yeah.
What was that?
The payment in lieu to support the trails.
Yeah.
For that, sure.
Yeah.
That would include active transportation.
What are you talking about?
Other transportation options.
We're not going to have very many non-motorized trails anymore.
Okay, we're
No, I
gonna
don't
get off
think we're on
topic
it.
here if we go down that path. But, okay, so
Really
we're gonna move on
fast.
to mixed use, okay? So, there seems to be a big push that, if we are going to accommodate additional growth in lodging, then we need to see more balance in the amount of, in offsetting, or we need to see other commercial uses or other uses that are needed by the visitors that will occupy those lodging units, okay? So that's where the basis of this category of mixed uses, okay? So, even though we're working together, Nora took the lead on the mixed use requirements and the aesthetic standards. In this table, you'll see, a variety of possible standards. I will say right out of the gates that I tend to agree with folks, whether they're representing hotels or they're representing real estate agents or representing, market researchers, that local governments are not really good at saying, you have to have X amount of retail space. There are so many mixed-use retail developments around the country that cannot fill those retail spaces for a variety of reasons. So, staff, I'm not going to be super supportive of you saying, like, you got to have 10,000 square feet of retail space for every hotel. And so I kind of like having some broad statements of, like, you got to do mixed use, but you figure out what that mixture of uses is going to be. That's just kind of generally speaking where I'm at on that. But you've got a bunch of standards in here. Some of them are very reasonable, and some,
mixed use be like a restaurant?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I have concerns that restaurants are like the low-hanging fruit of mixed use.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone, I feel like most people in this room are used to being on the customer side of being in a restaurant where it's annoying if you have to wait 30 minutes. But my experience managing restaurants and working with owners of restaurants is that currently it is, I would bet that every single restaurant in this town is understaffed. I would bet that every restaurant in this town is desperate to hire people. They'll hire anybody that walks in the door, whether they're qualified or not. I mean, if you need a specialty person, a sushi chef or something, you are in such a desperate spot because you can't attract outside people with skills to work. So my concern on mixed use is that it's going to lean real heavy on restaurants. That's going to impact the existing restaurants that live here you have to wait 30 minutes on the busiest weekend of the year, but like go into those restaurants on a Tuesday night and they're sending servers home because people can't make money. So I have some concerns about mixed use becoming just restaurants and those restaurants undercutting the existing restaurants that are already here on the ground, and also those restaurants having no employees to pull from. I would be very reluctant to open a restaurant today because I have no idea how I would staff it.
Well, and that's why I would think that the developer of a hotel is going to make the same calculation of like, what can I actually handle?
I just don't, maybe, yes. I would like to think that, but I feel like, I don't know. I'd like to think that, but I see new businesses opening up and I don't see more. So I don't know how people are keeping their businesses staffed, honestly.
Well, if they supply employee housing on or off-site, that might
So
make a
I
big
guess what
difference.
I would, like, I'm sorry, I think one option in mixed use could be something like a fee in lieu of, that would then go towards daycare centers or these other kind of business uses that, I mean, like Mr. Hahn brought up, it's not necessarily appropriate to require any business or, retail spaces that will be left empty. But I think incorporating into that mixed use some kind of alternative where it isn't just, there's a restaurant in every hotel now, and those restaurants are grossly understaffed.
And I think that, we are fully in support of that concept at the staff level as a fee in lieu, because I think we also acknowledge that not all mixtures of uses are appropriate on site. Like, she said, I mean, no, a doctor's office doesn't make sense in a hotel lobby. We're not, that naive.
And,
but there clearly are needs for mixtures of uses throughout the community, and so maybe a fee in lieu goes to an open space acquisition around town, or it helps to support the, Moab art trails or daycare, and it could be on-site, off-site. It could, I think the point is like, what we've seen in the past is just boxes of hotel rooms and nothing else to help
Right.
offset the demands of those tourists.
And I fully agree with that principle at its core. I just, and I apologize, I haven't brought this up more strongly in previous discussions with the Planning Commission, but in reviewing for this meeting today, that really got me thinking about the mixed use requirements specifically. And I think that's one area that we need to, not here, right now, today maybe, but
One of the,
flesh out a little further.
Sorry. So I can see both sides of that because, I'm probably more favorable towards the fee in lieu, because it's just cleaner and it allows the project to be its own project and not fuse other activities that don't gel with the activity, that's happening in that business. On the other hand, when those activities can be, so if you say like a laundromat or a restaurant, more in alignment with, say a hotel, the private sector knows how to build things better and quicker and more economical. But at the same time, if the goal there, if it's community oriented, we're wanting to prop up activities or services that aren't feasible currently in the market. And I think that's where the rub's at, is when we start talking. So if we're going to say, for sake of discussion, that's daycare, or a doctor's office, that's where the rub is. Yes, we need those things, but they're probably not appropriate, in a hotel. And so, I would agree that, I'm more favorable towards a fee in lieu, because I there's plenty of opportunities for the county to subsidize those things with that money, and even after the housing discussions died down and we're moving on to other things, if we have earmarked money that's available for those projects, then it's just as simple as cutting a check.
Yeah, and I think the point there is like, let the developer choose on whether to build the hotel or pay the fee in lieu.
Yeah.
Or provide open space that's available to the public, or pay the fee in lieu, or, whatever it is. Like, here's this list of potential mixed-use requirements, always with the idea that like a fee in lieu is an available option.
But the list is really important.
It is.
Because, say if, a laundromat or a restaurant made it in there, it shouldn't, because if you can't figure out how to make a restaurant or a laundromat pencil in this town, shouldn't be in that business. And we shouldn't be subsidizing it.
So,
I think another place that there's some value for it, though, is in maybe not a traditional hotel setting, but where it was something like there was retail space downstairs and, condos or townhomes or, upstairs. And so,
That's what I was going to mention. We talked about this with the Moab Planning Commission some, and, we don't want to force uses that don't make sense, obviously. But on the other hand, part of the reason that we are here today is because there was some consensus in the community that certain types of commercial uses were not being built because hotels were the highest and best use. People could make sort of the most money on a hotel or overnight accommodations, period. And so we are heavy on that and lacking on other kinds of commercial uses. So that's where I think we started with this, is that we weren't getting some of those commercial uses because overnight accommodations were kind of filling all those, that's what people are building. On the other hand, you don't want to require space that sits vacated. One thing that we did in Salt Lake City when I was there is we required it to be flex space. So until, and like with the apartment building or whatever, high density, until there are a certain number of bodies there in a hotel is the same thing, then a use might not make sense. But once the area is more built up, then they can convert it to a commercial use. So that's something we can talk about too.
yeah.
We were wondering sort of what this standard would look like, because we had thought about it in that vein, like, are we just going to have to build unoccupied space that we hang a for lease sign out? We didn't really know how that was going to work from a practical aspect. I wanted to get that out there because from our side of it, we had a lot of confusion around how this would operate. So we want to operate a hotel, right? We don't, just to be blunt about it, we don't want to operate anything else, and so we would, whatever the requirement was, that was sort of thought as, boy, we'd have to just lease that out, and whoever, we just want to collect a rent on that and hopefully it's satisfied. But I think if you sort of work through that in your head, you can see the difficulty that mixed use presents, from the private side, the developer side. It's just a challenge to figure out, well, and pardon my French, but how the hell are we going to do this,
And it may be more practical.
Yeah,
for
I totally get it. Like, therein lies the rub for the developer not wanting to do something that you don't want to do, and our community not getting anything but lodging units because that's what developers want to do.
But it goes beyond a developer not wanting to do something. It's whether it's even viable.
Well, sure.
The number is like 85% of hotel restaurants and bars lose money. This is before we even get into ancillary stuff that's in the back of a property where the sidewalk ends. It's hard to even grasp how anything would work.
Well, and I think
if a restaurant, if 85, 87% can't even make it, but it's there because it's in agreement with the flag of a hotel.
And
so I think what you're hearing from us is a real level of humility in saying, like, we don't know either, but we know that just hotel rooms isn't sufficient, right? I mean, I don't want to speak for the council, but I think that's what the community is saying is, like, we may not know exactly what that mix of uses is and what the minimum amount of square feet should be for a restaurant. And, it's great that you're participating in this conversation. I don't disagree. I'm not here to, say that 85% figure is wrong, but I'm here to say, we've seen nothing but hotel lodging development, and that is creating a real imbalance in the community. And so if you want the flexibility to create that space, for a beneficial use, we don't want dead space either.
That's where the fee in lieu is nice.
And that's where the fee in lieu is nice as well.
Assuming it's not a, figure that's, if it doesn't fit and you don't want to do it, you pay the fee and you put it in the hands of, of the public through the county or the city, and then, we turn that into some kind of utility for the public.
Mary?
When I was visualizing the mixed use, I think I was coming from a different point of view. I love the idea of fee in lieu of, but But I was looking at it more like, you know, I have a friend that is an incredible seamstress and can fix sewing machines, which is a big need in this town. But she can't afford to open up a shop. But if she could open up a shop and have overnight lodging above the shop to subsidize this other business, she could make a go of it. But she can't make a go of it by just providing that service. So I'm seeing the mixed use being used more by somebody that comes in with a desire to create a business that knows that there's not the year-round population to maintain that business. And so I want to keep that as an option, the mixed use, but then have the in lieu of.
A lot of the discussions that I'm seeing, you know, in the market and people that are in the lodging businesses, more consistent or existent than hotels are the nightly rental folks and developers. Their eyes light up with potential for mixed use, you know, more than hotels.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
They just have more flexibility, and it fits more with the nature of those, you know, or the reality of those businesses. And so, I mean, for me, for hotels, they're just a different animal than, you know, a condo or a twin home or an old apartment complex in Moab that's been converted to nightlies, or a new condo development. So I think when we look at that fee, I mean, that's a sensitive number. It shouldn't be a bar too high that discourages the development, but something where we feel like we're getting a good return.
That we could use to subsidize some of the needs in the community.
or, I mean, maybe more employee housing. I mean, there will be some that, at least in the county, will be required through the assured housing ordinance, but I perhaps, and that is on the mixed use list, but maybe allowing extra units of employee housing to count towards a mixed use of, like, not the assured housing that would already be
Above and
required,
beyond.
but anything on top of that could go towards mixed use. Because, I mean, I don't know, like, where are you gonna hire people for your hotel from? It seems like a real challenge. But also to say that businesses aren't moving forward without a plan on hiring. Like, are you a business that's moving forward without a plan on hiring?
No, I mean, we've conducted feasibility studies, and it's included in employment. I do absolutely agree with you that it will be a challenge. So we have looked at, you know, those affordable housing type options, and that's, you know, hopefully, maybe we can use that in combination to maybe use that as an incentive to have, you know, living quarters on site, things like that. We don't know that that's going to happen, but we have, in our feasibility study, that's an issue that was addressed, and we agree it's a challenge.
Zachariah's gone. We've lost our leader.
Just in time.
Just in time.
He was getting some low blood sugar, eh? I got that last night, got such a headache.
These are for me, huh? Thank you.
Yeah, I know. You can pass it around too.
Options on the table.
Put that in the record too.
Let the record show.
The M&M
Sure
stuff.
does have difficulty sharing.
So where are we at?
I think there's a big support for leaving mixed use in and including an option for fee in lieu of.
So, this is an area where I think there's a lot of opportunity to differentiate mixed-use requirements across different
For
open
sure.
accommodations types.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to ask for like a straw poll on this because I don't really know what I would be asking at this point, but I guess generally speaking, like, you know, this is a category that you definitely want the planning commission to continue working on, right? Yeah, they're like Moonflower, M&Ms.
Means they're good for you.
Organic. So again, just to get, I'm not going to ask for like a more, you know, quote quote-unquote formal straw poll on this, but it sounds like there's generally support for the mixed-use requirement, including a fee in lieu option. I think that we have a lot more work to do in terms of figuring out what this looks like, though. I am, sincere in saying I don't know what the, mix is, or, what the minimum square footage should be. And maybe this is an area where the county just says, you got to do some mixed use, but, you just present the concept to us in your master plan, and we review it and say whether it's sufficient or not. I mean, I don't think developers like that, so it's good to have a minimum. I don't know, clearly, we're fumbling a little bit at the staff level as well, because we are, we do have enough humility to say, where people have tried to really put a hard number on this in other communities, they've not done that well.
Right.
So.
A hard number meaning, percent, okay.
Yeah, meaning percentage or minimum square feet or something like that. So, I don't know. I mean, Planning Commission, keep working on it, and we'll revisit this with the County Council when we've got something a little bit more. Is that? Okay. The last category of standards are form-based standards or aesthetic standards. This is another category that I dished off to Nora because it's beyond my, it's not my area of expertise or area of comfort.
Well, we have civic space and open space before that, but.
Well, I guess I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, my approach, I think, is that those are just different options for mixed uses. But maybe
For
that's a
civic
good
space?
question for council, is do you want, and I will take a straw poll on this, I guess, do you want to require new accommodations developments to include civic space, meaning space that is open to the general public rather than only to the hotel guests?
Would be part of the mixed use?
Well,
They're all kind of in a similar subject, but there is quite a difference between mixed use and civic space and then even open space.
Yeah.
So just to get us started in that, I'm all for the option of a mixed use requirement or a fee in lieu, but I am not supportive of a civic or an open space requirement, especially on something like an urban development, that's on a smaller parcel. Do we really need an open space requirement there for that development? So I'm not in favor of a civic space requirement, and I'm very hesitant on an open space requirement. If someone's coming to the table and making a good chunk payment in lieu of development for some kind of, community benefit, that's fine with me. I draw the line there.
Would you see that being applicable for larger developments, like over a certain threshold, have a civic or open space requirement, or you would not support it on any side?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. If there was, so let's just say down the line we had a developer come forward in what's now highway commercial, and it was a big extravagant resort, and they were applying. I think when we start talking about open space there, and potentially even some civic space, I think that's much more, fair and realistic for us to ask for something like that. But something that, that's, so, I mean, we have zoning that's on the edge of city limits that's commercial area, and I'm thinking about open and civic space, and to me, it seems like it's going a bit too far. So, I don't know if you restrict that by the size of the parcel.
Moya Planning Commission recommends, or at least their discussions have been to eliminate the civic space thing just because it's so hard to define. And even fee and lieu, fee and lieu's are great, but they require actually quite a lot of time and energy in administration. You know, we have to keep track of the money and figure out what the eligible activities are, and, you know, there's really quite a bit of staff time involved in fee and lieu. But we also need money for things, so, you know, I think in many cases it makes sense. But our planning commission was not real wild about the civic space. On the open space, there was a lot of discussion about going up or out. And we're structuring it by zone. So there may be some areas of town, like the RC zone, where on the downside of 191, you want to allow more height because it doesn't really matter, and you could still see the Moab Rim or whatever it is you want to see. And maybe in some cases, the open space there is more important than the height. So anyway, just so you know the direction.
I would just add to that, we could also tie these things to these OAO districts that we eventually work on. I think it sounds like there's support for that, even if we don't take it up now. These like eligibility districts, the boundaries like we did for the high density housing overlay, because some of these requirements don't make sense in some areas but do in others. I would say the one conceptual justification for this, and I don't know that it's like, I actually don't know what you are specifically getting at in terms of civic space as well, except for like maybe a plaza kind of concept. But one of the things that I do lament about the way that, you know, Moab as a community has evolved in terms of urban form is that there is a lack of porosity between the public sphere and the very large lodging establishments that have been built in our community. Some have done an okay job of creating front facades that welcome the public and create a more dynamic interface between, you know, commercial development and the sidewalk, for instance. And others just completely close it off. And they're, without naming names, well, actually, can I?
Sure, go for it.
So just to illustrate the point, what I'm saying is, like, think about the Homewood Suites on Main Street, okay? I don't have any problem with the aesthetic of that building. And so, is everybody clear on which building I'm talking about?
The gray one.
The gray
Next to
one,
the old
yes.
Pablo place.
Yes. So next to the LaSalle House,
Where Wicked Brew was.
where Wicked Brew was, yes.
We know where.
I don't have any problem with the front facade in terms of, like, you know, aesthetics. My problem with that development is that it's a closed off, huge, you know, amount of linear footage that is totally closed off to the public and to the sidewalk, whereas that could have been open. There could have been, you know, tables outside, and you know, the entry to the hotel kind of set back, you know, another 10 feet, where you actually are like creating an interesting interface between the inside of that hotel and the public sphere on the outside. And that is, you know, we lack a lot of that. And so, you know, each hotel that goes in that doesn't have an element of that, and this doesn't really apply to yours, like you're set back so far from the highway, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
And so it's tricky to implement in terms of a standard, but I think that is when we were talking about this concept, that's where we were coming from.
And I think, again, you know, for Main Street, I don't think we want something like what we have with the Homewood Suites. I mean, it's not a Battleton building, and they've done a lot of things right, there's no doubt about it, but just, that is an example of where you could have required some retail spaces, because it's Main Street. You know, people would like to go in and
Or at least some sitting areas,
At least some
right?
sitting
Like,
areas,
throw
yeah.
a couple of concrete benches out there and
Well,
some
always looking
tables,
for
or like, you
places
know,
to sit.
whatever that might be. I think that's what staff was trying to get at with that requirement.
Yeah, shade structure with some tables and chairs or something.
So I guess the question to council, who we have left here, is, do you want us to pursue this idea at all?
Civic space?
Yeah.
I like civic space. I know that it's probably a harder concept to implement, but I guess what I'm visualizing is kind of like what Mike Bynum has out in his archway.
That's right.
Beautiful space for parties, weddings, whatever. And,
Oh, yeah,
that could
'cause you
be
use
part
it
of
all.
their mixed use, in my opinion. And it would be a tremendous service to the community. They could pay for that, rent the space.
And see, that's why, at least for the county, I think, the way that I see this civic space is that it's one option for meeting your mixed-use requirement.
I just make that's a good comment, because like if you add up mixed use, civic spaces, and open use, that definitely is not economically viable.
No.
You know what I mean?
But if they were kind of hooked together, that you have to
Yeah.
do so many of these.
Yes.
I would be hesitant of like somebody just throwing a bench, up in Thompson. That's like, oh yeah, anybody can sit on that bench. That's our civic space. It's like, but
Yeah.
but
Those places are going to be a little different.
right. But I think that could fit in as a mixed use
Right.
subcategory. Yeah.
And just to be clear, I think for most of the developments where we're going to be applying these, you're going to be seeing this stuff at the master plan level, right? With some of these developments that already have the overlay attached to them, you're going to have a little bit less control because they're going to be administrative standards, but I think we've got our marching orders. I didn't call for a straw poll on this because I don't think that we're at a place where that makes
That could be
sense.
straw polled.
But for the planning commissioners that are here, do you feel like you've gotten a little bit of direction on taking some additional steps with these mixed use and civic space and open space things?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking is there's some properties where, say, the Homewood Suites is an example that was brought up, where some mixed use and a more welcoming entryway and some civic or public access, not just guests, maybe would have made sense. There are other properties that, because of the distance they are from the highway or distance from town or whatever, probably it doesn't make sense. But I think as we go through a mapping exercise, if we do come out with some polygons that show where overnight accommodations will be allowed, we could kind of fine-tune those standards, the standards for those polygons, to say it would be applicable here and not applicable there. So at least we could talk about, does public space in this location make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, that's,
Okay.
let's have some more work and then bring it back to us for a straw vote before we.
Yeah. We- Do we have enough willpower to get through? There are a lot of different aesthetic standards
Yeah,
that are in that list.
and I certainly hear what Chief was saying, Mr. Hahn was saying about micromanaging aesthetics. And we can certainly cut back on these. I just sort of put everything out there that I could think
Yeah.
of.
And we had a good discussion at our last planning
Yeah.
commission with you, Nora, and I really appreciate it. I think we can tease some of that out. One of the standards that I think we should try to get to before the day is over is the density and scale standard.
Yeah, density and scale.
So I thought, and I'll kick this one off, but I was thinking of new hotels and new other overnight accommodations as being kind of mom and pop places and little boutique hotels and small locally owned facilities that could generate money and provide some employment for people who live here in Moab. So I don't know if the council wants us to go in that direction, but I would say limiting the size and the limit of the number of rooms on hotel rooms would help us get towards at least that goal. But maybe you'll decide that you don't want to have any limits on the size of these international chain hotels that come into town, and no controls over the types of overnight accommodations. But to me, I thought this was an opportunity to say, hey, listen, we can really encourage the development of smaller, locally owned hotels that would actually be a benefit to us rather than more big boxes.
I agree. That's why I was thinking of like somebody that comes in and wants to do a business but knows they don't have enough, and be able to subsidize that by having a couple, 3 overnight rentals above their storefront would be.
I think that's a brilliant idea, especially for downtown, like our sort of First West downtown Moab thing. That's perfect.
There are services. I mean, I know so many quilters that are taking their machines over to Grand Junction, for their services, and people that have, nobody's here to fix your small lawnmowers.
So we talked with our planning commission a fair amount about this at their last meeting, and my question was, do we want to try to regulate overall size of a project, or do we just want to say a building can only be this big and you have to break it up into different buildings if it's over a certain size? Maybe both. And our planning commission, basically, we talked about it, and they kind of want to think about it. And I gave them some example square footages of various buildings, and we talked about the New World Mark versus the boxy whatevers. And World Mark is a huge project, but it's a whole bunch of different buildings. Is that better? And that works where it is, but it probably doesn't work downtown. So, I don't know. It's a good question, and I was trying to get some direction from the planning commission, and we didn't quite get there, but.
Yeah, it's tough for sure. I think about like some of the areas, like maybe the North Corridor or something, where you kind of fill some of those needs, and they might pencil out easier with more rooms, versus other areas where the more boutique, might be good. So.
But I wouldn't mind having this written so that it does encourage people to think along those lines of bringing in services but being able to still make a living, because we don't have the year-round population for a lot of those services.
Yeah, Mary, I wasn't talking specifically about mixed use as much as I was talking about, does the county want to limit the size of overnight accommodations? Do we want 30-room hotels as a maximum size? Do we want 50-room condominium units as a maximum size, or something smaller or something larger, or just let the market decide what they build, and we'll just make sure the paint looks nice and we like the color of the roof? I don't know that's the question.
Yeah.
Do we want?
I think that there's a big is too big. But we have underlying building standards in place. Is that something that would
We
carry?
don't really have anything that would, cap a size of a hotel right now.
Oh, no?
We don't have any limit on the number of rooms or the size.
Is that something we need to investigate, or how can we
Yeah.
move forward?
Well, I will say that certainly one of the chief complaints we heard in the early part of throughout the moratorium process was, residents of this community had seen enough big box hotels, and there were a few referenced frequently. But, generally speaking, I think, that is a discussion that the community wants you to have.
I do too.
I do too.
I would like to, I would like to stop the chains if possible. I mean, because they come in, they're so big that if the market starts to go down, it's not going to hurt them because they'll be able to have a tax write-off by this motel
Well,
not making money. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down that because
We
we're not going to
can't-
regulate who
Can't do that.
can or can't. There are plenty of chain hotels also that, that, you know, have complied with local standards and they look different than what you would expect. It's up to them to decide on whether they want to be in a market or not based on the local regulations and the local economy. And the reality is that even if you see, you know, a Hampton Inn or a Motel 6 or a, you know, Hyatt name on a building, they're just getting the 10% brand fee, and it's still owned by individuals, right, or an LLC. You know, even though we have many flagship names on hotels here, those hotels were, you know, developed by 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 people.
Okay, we can move on.
I would be interested in seeing some stabs at, or comparisons of like, you know, ones that are currently here that we're familiar with and what their square footage is, what their room count is, that kind of thing. And then, you know, kind of have that as a baseline to compare things to.
I would just suggest too that you maybe consider what are the policy considerations behind that decision. Why does it matter to the
Right.
community that it's larger, it's smaller, or whatever? What are those policy decisions? That probably ought to drive that discussion.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the feedback that we got in the, you know, should we do this kind of phase was a lot of aesthetics too. And,
Yeah.
and that, not just for residents, but visitors that are coming to the area and you know, trying to protect the view shed and the feeling in the valley and what one massive castle could do to affect that for everyone.
And that might not be more about the number of rooms, that might be a height restriction. Or
Right.
it might be,
Yeah,
Making of the mass,
yeah.
which is what some of these others try to get at.
Yeah.
Try to make them more attractive.
So the height one is important to me because there's probably another window or windgate is that you can't see the room from the highway.
Yeah, I hate that.
Okay, that's, our planning commission totally agrees with that.
Sorry, did I skip ahead?
No,
I thought we had
no.
consensus.
Well, to tag on to what Evan suggested, if we could have kind of a sample of different hotels that we're all familiar with and their size, square footage, their height, and the number of guest rooms, from biggest to smallest, I think that would give the Planning Commission at least an idea of where we could start talking about the pros and cons of trying to limit the size of these buildings. And we'll make a recommendation to the council at some time in the future and say this is the rationale for why we recommend whatever we recommend.
I think a lot of it is the aesthetics. Is it going to look good when it's built? And is it going to block the rim? I think people really hate having the rim blocked. That's why we live here in the valley.
Okay, so just for conversation purposes, this is a presentation that I gave at the National APA Conference with McKay Edwards, who is a local developer. He developed, he doesn't live in Moab, but he developed Moab Springs Ranch. He has also developed in Park City and Springdale and in Canada.
Good guy.
Okay, these are 2 Hampton Inns. One's in Moab, one's in Springdale. Okay, you know which one is which.
Yes.
Okay, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
one in Springdale is a climbing.
Is it?
I like Springdale.
So maybe you know McKay. So, I mean, you know, this is, you know, so you get it as well, right? This is the issue at hand. This is the hotel everyone loves to hate. uh, you know, these are the differences in terms of form-based standards that are being, contemplated right now. And it's not my area of expertise, so I'm really grateful that Nora is here helping with this, category of standards. I do think, this is clearly an area where, Paul, you and your team are keeping an eye on what the county wants to do. I will admit, I'm concerned about having too many standards that are going to be onerous for staff to implement, and I don't want to go down the route of having a design review committee, which turns into a political mess in communities that try to implement them. So, I guess what I'm just saying right now is from a staff perspective, I'm going to be really trying to advocate for a balanced approach here. I don't think that it's unreasonable to say, let's have some caps on, density or massing on the property. But I also appreciate that there's a relationship between, that you can address a lot of the concerns about size and scale with design standards, right?
Well, design and scale was the only consideration that we heard prior to the moratorium with all the open houses. I would say, okay, that we got it taken care of. But a lot of people think that there are way too many hotels, way too many hotel rooms, way too many B&Bs, way too many other overnight accommodations. So how do we address that?
Right.
If the only way to do it is through scale. So if we just want to ignore that the people have spoken and given us direction, we can just allow infinite size hotels as long as they look good. But I don't think that's really what the public has asked the county to do.
And that's really I see that as really a policy question for our councils, to really give direction on. I mean, the planning commission can have ideas, but, that's a kind of a big thing, big decision as to which way to go.
Well, I think.
Yeah, I don't want to rush those discussions. I don't know what our stamina is at now for getting into the design. Yeah.
More chocolate.
More chocolate.
So what I would say is I think today's discussion has been a really good start. I think that we probably need to spend just as much time on these last two categories in a follow-up meeting. We're going to run out of time quickly in terms of adoption process, meeting that January deadline. And, I think the other part is maybe we get some standards in place and we continue working on other standards. That's okay too. Obviously we have one developer waiting in the folds to try to, get their project off the ground. And, we don't have to hit the grand slam with this one project. I don't want anybody to feel like that. And I don't want you to feel like that either.
Thanks for having us here.
It's a much larger conversation than that. And let's try to get as much done as we can in the next, 2 months. But we don't need to adopt stuff just to adopt stuff.
Yeah. Good.
I will say Wednesdays at 2 look right in here,
Okay.
in general.
Everybody's here.
How long, we also.
It's hard for you, I'm sure.
I had to rearrange my entire week, but that's okay. But that is okay.
You're going to have at least 1 or 2 planning meetings, right, between, or
We have-
one?
Well, our statutory requirements are that we need to have one planning commission public hearing and one county council public hearing. And we're approaching a time of year where it's difficult to do that. We only have one planning commission meeting in November and one in December. So basically what I anticipate is that we need to have a public hearing on what's the second Tuesday in December?
December 10th.
So we need to have a planning commission public hearing on December 10th and then a county council public hearing on January
On what?
On
2nd.
this,
On
on
whatever
the new
we're
design
gonna approve.
standards.
That's fast.
Well, I think,
January 7th.
7th. So,
And again, we can't do everything, you know, we should do what we can do and do it so that we're comfortable with it, and not just throw things in because we think we need to address it when we really don't have the background for it.
Yeah, I'd say aim for the low-hanging fruit. Get
But these
something, and then
standards,
we can
a
come
lot
back.
of it comes from my experience in Salt Lake City when the big push for all the apartments. You know, there are all kinds of apartments in downtown Salt Lake City. In fact, I lived in one. And some of this is based on livability, and even if it's not apartments, and also just visual impact and durability. Is also something that is really important.
How do the chambers look on Thursday afternoons? Like, right after the budget advisory board?
You're killing me. Let's see. In general, not very good.
How about Mondays? Mondays don't seem.
But I will say Tuesdays before your county council meetings.
We already
you were
don't,
free.
don't we already have something for next?
You are
No, nothing
free
else.
wherever you want, as far as I can tell.
Seems like
There's also
last
5
time we
Tuesdays in
talked about
October, if you guys want to try to manage that.
Yeah.
So your Tuesdays
Wednesday.
at 3 or 2, whatever you want to do.
you know, that's probably good timing as well, because we're gonna need some time with the planning commission and at the staff level to take the next round of, you know, present the next round of updates.
So you're talking about the 15th?
So,
No, well, I won't be here on the 15th, but maybe on the.
October
29th.
29th.
October 29th?
Special council meeting,
Yeah.
29th, fifth Tuesday.
I need,
You can make it, let's see, the council chair was just taken from 2 to 5.
yeah.
Yeah, that's up to, that's the steering committee.
What date are you talking, the
Is that
19th?
I'm sorry.
29th, last I heard, but was
I
it
should not be
29th?
like planned around at
Or
all.
did I just?
Fine, but we do need more, I mean, whether it's the 29th
Sorry,
or
were you
30th.
talking about the 19th?
Yeah, doesn't matter. But
Should
we
we-
need some, we
Fifth
need a few
Tuesday of
weeks to.
October.
Should we
Oh,
have
God,
a
that's
October.
a
Yeah.
calendar
Yeah.
discussion item at the next council meeting, the 15th, or even later?
Yeah, that would be fine. I won't be at that meeting, but I think that's perfectly fine for you all to decide, you know, when, either the last week of October or the first week of November, you want to have a follow-up workshop.
I guess, could you give us an update at that meeting about whether, if we're ready for the 5th week on Tuesday, or if we should wait till November, the first week in November?
Well, I mean, we can be ready for whenever you can schedule it. I mean, if it's the last week of October or the first week of November, we'll be ready, but
Can you
say that
make
with
it
such
to have that?
confidence. Wait till the week of.
Calendar discussion.
Better make it the first week of November.
Wait, why was that?
So,
Was that just decided? It should be the first
Yeah.
week of November? Okay,
so from my
I was-
standpoint, or from the planning commission standpoint, we'll have a planning commission meeting on November 12th.
Not
So-
the second one.
Huh?
Right.
And we won't have a.
Yeah, we
second
won't have
one.
a second one, so we'll have one bite of the apple in November, and then we'll go, our next meeting will be the hearing. So I think if we could have it in October, rather than wait until November,
It just seems
To
like
give us
waiting
little
till
more
November
time.
is just pushing it too close.
For all of us to meet before your second meeting in October? Have you had your, no, today's the second.
Before the meeting.
before the
in
November
November
meeting.
12th.
We'll only have one meeting in November.
So I really encourage you guys to look at that 5th Tuesday, that's what it's for, workshops, October 23rd.
Good.
That'll work for staff. I mean, you know, we'll get as far as we can.
Can we do it in
We'll
the
do it.
morning instead of the afternoon? Because I know, is it just, is that, the 29th isn't a planning meeting, right?
No.
Seems like oftentimes they're right after.
The CDBG, there's a CDBG workshop at 2 that I at least want one person on my staff to attend.
And our council chambers is not available at 2 anyway, so the morning
Yeah.
or lunch.
The morning would work, Ruth?
Morning
On the 29th, yeah.
is wide open for this room.
And you'd be able to attend?
Fifth morning of the 29th, what time?
We'll bring a cake.
8:30?
I'll bring cake.
I'll be in town.
10?
Do you need time to prep beforehand, or?
Yeah, maybe 10, and then, you know, if you guys want to have lunch at the tail end of it, you can earn your reward, or...
I'm scheduled to be off that day, but I'm.
We should also make some time for Abby's birthday.
Which is on the 29th.
Well, that's my birthday on the 29th, but I might be out of
So we'll
town.
bring
But I gotta look at that. I'll bring cupcakes if I go. Thanks.
Okay, so why don't we say the 29th, and you guys finalize the time at your next council
I
meeting?
thought we said.
Or do we have enough?
Why don't we just say?
Let's say 10.
10 o'clock? Okay.
That's easier than going.
Okay.
Get too many.
All right.
Should we do lunch, or is that, do you feel like 2 hours will be enough, or is that,
I hope so.
okay?
9:30 is good, or, you know?
I mean, if it goes to 12:30, I think that's fine.
Bring it in.
You could do
So,
lunch.
I got 10 o'clock
If we have.
on October 28th.
If we have to make a decision to order pizza at 11 o'clock, we can do that.
10 o'clock? One night.
Pizza sounds good.
10 o'clock. on the 29th. Okay. Well, thank you all for your sustained focus.
This was good, I
Yeah.
thought.
Thank you, Zachariah and Nora and your offices for all the work you guys have done putting this together.
It'd be great if this is
I'm
all we
really
had to do.
I'm really excited to see the county-city collaboration. This makes me really happy, because I've been wanting to see this for a long time.
With that, that brings us to the end of our agenda, and I would adjourn this meeting at 4:43.
So we talked a little bit about reflectivity of glass.
Yeah. Yes.
But I think non-reflective surfaces in general, particularly roofs, if they're not flat roofs.
Non-reflective, yes.
Welcome.
Yes, that's a good idea. And we also don't want like the lantern.
Oh, yeah.